In a distant Japanese winter, when the wind howled like an angry army from the sky, the samurai stood in their heavy clothes and with their frozen swords, waiting for the morning. The battle was not their only enemy. The cold itself was an invisible, unkillable foe that attacked the fingers first, then the resolve. That era held a severity unknown to the generation of heaters and air conditioners. Snow covered everything, even memory, and leaving the house was an adventure akin to war. Yet, the samurai maintained their upright posture and a calm demeanor, as if contemplating death while sipping tea. Curiously, the Japanese of that time did not write about the cold as a catastrophe, but as a test of honor. A true warrior was not measured by his sword, but by his ability to endure the wind that lashed his face. They laughed in the face of the snow, as if negotiating respect with nature. And everyone who survived that winter became a legend told around wood fires. You might think this is an exaggeration, but imagine your fingers freezing as you try to tie your iron armor, or training in swordsmanship amidst a white storm with no sound but the friction of the wind against the blade. Nevertheless, they kept training, as if saying to the cold, if you want to bring us down, start from the inside. The snow covered the roads, blurring the boundaries between mountains and valleys. Every step was an adventure, and the ground would not tell you if you were walking on a path or over a frozen river. Yet, the samurai continued their journey, placing their feet with strange certainty, as if walking on nothingness with the confidence of one who maintains balance between heaven and earth. Horses tired before the day even began, their hooves sinking into the ice up to their knees. The warriors would dismount and push them with their hands, sometimes laughing from the sheer pain. One would say to his comrade, at least no one needs to wash his armor, nature takes care of everything here. That small laugh in the face of death was what kept their hearts warm amidst the frost. They marched in long lines, like shadows, each following the tracks of the one ahead to avoid getting lost. The wind cut their faces like knives, and the snow clung to their hair until they looked like crystal-covered trees. Despite all this, they maintained a dignified silence, broken only by the sound of swords rubbing against armor. Food was scarce, and water froze inside the water skins before it reached their mouths. They would melt the snow over the fire and drink it like a bitter medicine, not fresh water. Some would bury rice in the snow to keep it edible, while others simply relied on the steam from their broth to feel alive. It was a heavy life, but it proceeded with the steps of a warrior who knew that retreat was sometimes more precious than death. On some nights, they would stop near forests to build a small camp, gathering firewood with difficulty and lighting it with unparalleled patience. The fires made a sound like breathing, as if sharing the battle against the cold. They sat around them quietly, each extending his hands toward the light, then laughing when he saw the smoke wrapping around his fingers like a friendly ghost. The samurai did not need a leader to order them to continue, the cold itself became their stern guide. It taught them discipline without instruction. Whoever lagged behind the convoy would freeze, and whoever complained too much would lose their voice to the wind. Thus, silence became wisdom, slowness a virtue, and walking a delicate art learned by the feet, not the mind. Even with all this misery, there was a kind of beauty in the journey. The mountains turned white like quiet spirits, and the sunset reflected on the ice as if the sky was sending them a silent message, you are still here, and that alone is a small victory. Nature was cruel, but it was honest, it deceived no one, punishing and rewarding at the same time. At the end of the day, when they reached the small stone shelter, they would place their swords beside them and sleep in their heavy clothes. Their faces were wrinkled from the wind, but their expressions were reassured because they had lived another day in a merciless white hell. Thus, walking through the snow became a kind of worship, performed not with words, but with steps on a path that knew no mercy. Perhaps the world has changed and the snows have melted, but those journeys remained in the memory of the Japanese as proof that discipline is stronger than the weather, and that true courage doesn't need an audience, only a heart that stands firm when warmth flees from everywhere. The samurai did not face winter with weapons, but with discipline. Their bodies treated the cold as an opponent to be respected, not an enemy to be hated. Their first rule was that fear of the cold is more dangerous than the cold itself. So, they would smile while shivering, as if mocking the body's weakness before it will trained in patience. Training never stopped, even on the coldest days. They would stand in the snow, sometimes barefoot, raising their swords with semi-frozen arms, breathing slowly and deliberately, as if negotiating a truce with the cold. The mind, for them, was more important than warmth, and whoever lost focus lost more than their body heat. Their clothing was not insulating as we imagine, but heavy and tough. The iron would sting the skin from the intense cold, yet they refused to cover it with cloth, because for them, dignity does not wear many layers. The samurai saw suffering as a means to temper the soul, and the cold was merely a strict, uncompromising Japanese teacher. In the stone fortresses, the temperature dropped below the threshold of life. The walls wept white vapor from the humidity, and the air entered through every gap like a knife testing their patience. Yet, the guards continued their night watches without complaint, moving their fingers in the air to stay alive and practicing silence as others practice prayer. Strangely, they found a kind of clarity in the cold. One of their wise men said, "When the body cools, the heart becomes clear." For them, suffering was a mirror that revealed what was inside when the warmth of the outside disappeared. They did not treat winter as a punishment, but as a test to prove that man can live on will when the fire runs out. They would drink bitter herbal tea to awaken the blood and eat light food that helped the body endure, not become lazy. They sometimes slept sitting up so as not to lose consciousness from extreme fatigue, and washed their faces with semi-frozen water every morning as a psychological exercise in enduring pain. Despite all this discipline, there were unforgettable moments of sarcasm among them. One, shivering near the river, said, "The snow hates me because I am whiter than it is," and the others laughed until tears streamed from their eyes before freezing on their cheeks. Perhaps laughter was their last weapon, a weapon not forged in temples nor broken in battles. By the end of that winter, many emerged with lean bodies but with eyes full of a strange light, a light granted not by the sun, but by experience. From then on, the samurai became an example of steadfastness, not because they won a war, but because they stood firm against nature itself without losing their pride or their ability to smile. Thus, that winter became a mark in Japanese history, narrated not as a story about the cold, but as a lesson in humanity, that strength is not measured by heat, but by what remains burning in the heart when everything around it freezes. When Japan froze under a white shroud of snow, warmth became a rare idea, like the sun. The samurai devised tricks that were closer to magic. They believed that survival belonged to the intelligent, not the strongest. Thus, they turned the simplest things into means of survival. The stone became a friend, steam became a wall, and laughter became a human heater resisting the cold silence. They would place stones near the fire until they were red hot, then wrap them in pieces of cloth and hide them under their clothes or near their stomachs. The heat of the stone would spread slowly, tricking the body into thinking life was fine. Some carried a small stone in their belt as a thermal amulet that never left the body. One joked, "At least this stone doesn't run away in the middle of the night like some friends." In the fortresses, they used a stranger method. They would dig a small hole in the ground beneath their sitting spot, place burning charcoal in it, and cover it with sand. The warriors would sit over it and exchange stories, laughing until smoke billowed between their fingers. Due to the extreme cold, no one minded that they were breathing ash instead of air. Inside the tents, the trick was even more cunning. They made blankets from rice straw, weaving them themselves and placing a layer of dry leaves between the weaves. Those leaves retained heat like a plant secret, and the herbaceous scent gave the place a strange tranquility, as if the forest itself was lending them some of its spirit. In the distant mountains, some relied on animals. They would tie their horses near the camp, as the air around the horse's body was warm enough to save a human. The warrior would curl up near the animal that shared the journey, as if nature was justly redistributing its warmth among all creatures. The samurai did not beg the weather for mercy, they challenged it with a strange philosophical approach. If the cold intensified, they would sit in meditation, focusing on a slow breath from the nose to the chest. They said that fire begins in the lungs, not the wood. They trained their minds to send imaginary warmth to the body, and with repetition, the illusion became reality, and the mind stronger than the frost. Even laughter became a weapon. They mocked the cold to break its awe. One night, one of them said, "This year's snow is so generous, it entered the door without an invitation and sat with us." Everyone burst into laughter, and some even forgot their shivering. Perhaps they did not conquer nature, but they defeated it with a light spirit that knew how to joke with pain. While villages froze and people hid in their homes, the samurai walked through the wind as if they were made of an unquenchable fire. Every step carried them from life to wisdom, and from coldness to a kind of serenity known only to those who lived on the edge between death and laughter. Thus, warmth for them transformed from a physical need into an inner philosophy, a lesson in noble deception of nature, to deal with the cold not as an enemy, but as a strict trainer who makes you a person who doesn't need fire to know they are alive. The snow covered the fields, making food an adventure, not a meal. The samurai were forced to treat the kitchen as a second battlefield. Every grain of rice was counted like a bullet, and every piece of fish was treated like a sacred bounty. The cold was merciless, but it made them more inventive than the chefs in the palaces of kings. The first trick was storing rice in bags buried inside the frozen ground. The heat of the subsoil kept it edible for long weeks. When they needed it, they dug it up like a small treasure and cooked it over a low fire so that not all of its steam evaporated. They joked, "He who owns a warm hole doesn't need a fancy kitchen." Fish was their favorite food. When the rivers stopped flowing, they would place their nets under the ice layer and break it every morning with axes. They would pull out the fish, frozen, and laugh, saying, "We've caught dinner and the refrigerator together." They would then melt it over hot stones, and the steam would rise into the cold air like a small promise of life. Wild herbs were their second salvation. They gathered them during the day and dried them near the fire until they became like tinder. Then they cooked them with a little water and salt. The taste was bitter, but they loved it because it reminded them that bitterness is also a taste of survival. Every bite was a lesson in patience more than a meal for energy. Meat was as rare as miracles, taken from deer or birds brought down by the storms. It was quickly roasted over charcoal so it wouldn't freeze again, then divided equally among the men. One said, laughing while distributing the pieces, "In war, we fight with swords, and in hunger, we fight with justice." Hot tea became a symbol of purity. They prepared it in small wooden vessels to keep its warmth as long as possible. They raised it slowly to their mouths, as if drinking light, not liquid. Some would add a little ginger to ignite the blood in their veins. They would say, "The small cup defeats the big winter." On some harsh nights, when hunger intensified, one would cook the remaining rice and water in a single pot, stirring it with his wooden stick. He would offer it silently to everyone, and they would eat, smiling, not because the food was delicious, but because they were sharing the cold severity just as warriors share victory. Unity is broken more by a shared bite than by swords. And because they were people who left no moment meaningless, their simple meals turned into a ritual of gratitude. Every time they lit a fire to cook their soup, they saluted nature, which still granted them something to live on. Even the inanimate had its respect. The stone that heated their food was called the silent friend. As weeks passed, eating became a kind of military art, cooked quickly, shared in the making, and every bite eaten as if it were the last remaining in the world. Thus, they learned that hunger is not defeated by luxury, but by imagination, and that an empty pot sometimes contains something more precious than food, companionship, patience, and laughter in the face of the cold. At the end of the winter, when the snow began to melt and the scent of the earth rose anew, they sat around the fire and recalled those long nights. One, holding his empty wooden bowl, said, "This bowl taught me more than my teachers." The other laughed, saying, "And he who eats after the ice will never fear life again." Night in those days was not just a time for sleep, but a real test of patience. The hours stretched as if time had frozen with the snow. The moon reflected on the whiteness until everything around them was illuminated without life, no movement, no sound except their broken breathing amidst a silence that resembled fear. The samurai knew that the danger in the dark was not the enemy, but thoughts. When you sit alone with yourself in the cold for too long, your mind begins to speak louder than the wind, reminding you of everything you try to forget. Therefore, they treated the night as a psychological opponent that could only be defeated by calmness. They sat contemplating the small fire in front of them, as if watching their thoughts slowly burn. The camps would drift off to the rhythm of silence. Each soldier placed his sword beside him and pulled the cover over his shoulders. No one spoke, but everyone heard every breath around him, a unity that bound them more than words. One even said one night, "The snow sings a song without a melody, but it silences the heart." In those long nights, the senses changed. Eyes saw more than they saw during the day, and ears could distinguish the movement of the wind from the movement of a wolf. They lived in a state of perpetual vigilance that was not like caution, but like meditation. Every sound in the silence was a message, and every moment without movement was an exercise in self-control. Oddly, some samurai trained themselves to sleep in the snow for mere minutes, then wake up suddenly, an experiment they called short death, to know how the body faces the end before returning. They would joke, "He who has died a little doesn't fear the cold much." A light laugh would rise between the steam of their breaths and the white sky. Because they saw a lesson in every situation, the night became a teacher of silence, and the cold a test of thought. Every one of them emerged from that experience calmer, more understanding of life. When you face nature in its harshest forms, you discover that the real danger was not outside, but within yourself. In the morning, when the first thread of snow melted under the sun, they would rise as if returning from a long inner battle. They tied their armor calmly and smiled a small smile that said, "The night tested us and did not win." That smile alone was the greatest victory recorded by history without a battle. Thus, the night in the samurai's memory became not a symbol of fear, but of cleansing, a space where man washed his voice of shouting and his noise of the day, learning that strength doesn't need words and that the greatest wars are those fought silently, facing only oneself. When the samurai ascended the mountains, they did not climb to escape the cold, but in search of meaning. For them, mountains were not stones and snow, but open temples to the sky. Every step toward the summit was a silent prayer, the body progressing slowly and the soul lightly. The frost stung their faces and the air slapped their breaths, but their eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the earth ended and meditation began. The Japanese peaks in that winter were closer to a dream, endless whiteness, and a stillness that confused the senses, as if the whole world had decided to stop speaking. In that quiet, the samurai sat cross-legged on the cold rocks like monks. They closed their eyes and let out long breaths. They told themselves that patience is learned not in battles, but in facing nature that cares for no one. They saw the mountains as a mirror reflecting their hearts. Whoever ascends them sees himself without masks, and the air there strips man of his shouting, so he hears only the beating of his own heart, learning how to listen to his inner self again. One wrote in his old diary, "Every step I climbed, an old desire fell away from me, as if he was being cleansed by the frost just as people are cleansed by water." They contemplated the snow as it slowly fell onto their swords, turning the iron into a mirror for the sky, a simple scene, but it taught them more than 1,000 sermons: beauty in simplicity, strength in silence, and greatness in keeping your hands steady even when your fingers tremble from the cold. In the high mountains, time became slow, as if walking on its tiptoes, neither night nor day, just a gray light that enveloped things and made them similar. And there, they understood that man is not the master of nature as he thinks, but a small guest at a large table of ice and wind. He must eat with thanks and leave with courtesy. One of the elders said to his disciples, looking at the frozen valley, "The mountains do not speak, but they understand those who visit them, and whoever listens to them returns changed." Since that day, ascending the mountains became a part of samurai training, not to strengthen the body, but to tame arrogance, for strength without humility becomes an absurdity, just as a sword without a wise hand becomes a danger to its owner. There were strange rituals they practiced at the summits. They would sit bare-shouldered in the snow for hours without moving, contemplating the clouds passing beneath them. They said that when the body freezes, the soul calms down, and that when pain reaches its peak, it turns into clarity. They believed that when man accepts the cold, he becomes part of the mountain, not a guest on it. In those moments of silence, no one thought of war, glory, or wealth. They remembered the small houses in the plains, the voices of children, and the scent of warm rice, and they asked themselves inwardly, what is the point of victory if one loses the warmth of his heart? These questions pursued them more than any enemy they faced on the field. And when the snow finally melted, they descended from the peaks with changed faces, not because they had won, but because they had understood. They understood that strength lies not in conquering the cold, but in coexisting with it, and that greatness lies not in raising swords, but in lowering one's voice before the majesty of nature. The mountains changed them with their silence more than wars changed them with their noise. At the end of the story, Japan still carries in its mountains the lessons of those men. Their silence became wisdom, and their cold became a legend. Even today, when people ascend the white peaks, they feel a mysterious thing that resembles respect, as if the souls of the samurai are still there, watching from afar, smiling quietly, and whispering to the passers-by, "Winter defeats no one except those who lose the warmth in their heart."